Okay.
Great. So welcome, everyone, and welcome Tom Lin, our guest tonight, the author of The Thousand Crimes of Ming. And we're really happy to see you. And there you go. I should have the book right over my shoulder here.
Got it right here.
Yeah. And we've been actually your book is an onion, and we peeled about halfway through it. I think in the 20 or 30 minutes we were chatting before, with all of the interest. So I just want to welcome you, and I think I'll open it right up to questions. And I guess I'll just start with my own. My very first impressions of this book were, I was struck by the landscape and how wonderfully you captured it. And I'm curious about the work you did in that regard. And we can just kind of start the questions with that, and then there'll be more, I'm sure, from the rest of the group.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that the landscape rang true for like a dyed-in-the-wool Nevadan like yourself. I was born and raised. Actually, I was born in Beijing, but I grew up in New York City. So I was a city kid for most of my life. And I went out to Pomona for college in Southern California, and that was about the same time that I got my first car. And I think it's a qualitatively different experience to get your first car, as a liberated 18-year-old than as someone under your parents' thumb as a teenager, because I took that car everywhere, and there was no one to tell me, not to drive out at 2 a.m. to go look at some rocks. And so that's exactly what I did. I spent pretty much all of college, as soon as I got my car, just driving back and forth across the Mojave, driving up, checking out the Sierras, Yosemite. And I had truly never seen landscapes like that before in my life. I mean, I'd seen them in movies, and, you kind of convince yourself that nowhere on earth actually looks like that, full time without color grading. And it was, it astonished me. And I felt that it was necessary for me to kind of write something that spoke to that experience that I was having, this kind of almost mystical immersion in the landscape. And so I ended up driving along the 80 back and forth, probably like 6 times, which is admittedly a long time to spend in a car. But, I had my excuses either way. I was either coming back from college or moving out west. And so I had a kind of old structure of rationales for why I would be on that road so often. But I would pull off every couple of exits and get out of the car. It would I did these trips usually in August, and so it would be 115 to the point where like my car's AC couldn't really keep the heat out. It was just a matter of like not having heat stroke behind the wheel. Because I think part of my research process involves this belief that like it's very difficult to simulate reality convincingly if it really is just full imagination. And so for me, it was important to go to these places and kind of have this bodily experience, and then attempt to push that experience through this kind of literary technology that hopefully would result in, the same kind of feeling being reproduced in the reader. And so, yeah, I went to all these places, Elko, Battle Mountain, and they've still got the big BM up on the hillside for the from when they did the air mails. And these places are they were once so important for this kind of massive infrastructural project, and now as planes have kind of taken over, they've withered away to these kinds of like very basic towns. And I think much of that history remains to be kind of rediscovered and brought back out. And so I think it was really fruitful for me to go to these places and talk to those people and get a feel for what it was like there. And then try to get back home and try to put that into words. So I'm really glad the landscape came out. I think it's one of the most marvelous places in the U.S.
Can I go ahead and ask a question, John?
Yeah, please go ahead, Nick.
I'm interested. In your book, it says that you're in a PhD program, but it doesn't say what kind.
That I am.
And so I was kind of wondering how your academic work informs your creative work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think so. I'm in a PhD program for literature, English literature, and I'm studying science fiction and aerospace technologies, and I think generally I don't know if they inform each other so much as I borrow some kind of research practices from my academic work. So I have this whole list of sources. I have a bibliography for 1,000 Crimes of Ming. And I think that kind of rigor of sourcing and research was really helpful for me, because it also helps keep the story kind of contained. It turns out, if you're a writer and you never finish your book, really what you are is delusional, because you're entertaining this kind of extensive story with people that don't exist in a time that you were never alive. So, as long as you write it down, it makes you a writer and not someone who's just having extensive hallucination. But I would take those research practices and try to kind of put them into the work of recreating for myself what it would have been like, in 1869. And the other really good thing is that I think one provides a refuge from the other. So I think, academic work and creative work are, on each on their own, pretty exhausting. But it is useful to be able to kind of flip a switch and say, this creative work has really been kicking my teeth in. I'm going to flip over and I'm going to just try to like digest some, big old theory books for a couple of weeks, and then see if I can come back a little fresher. But it, I think a lot of people are very impressed that I seem to have written a book while in grad school, and I just want to make clear that that is not the case. I actually I finished my book out of a kind of paralytic fear that once I started graduate school, I would not be able to get anything else done. And so I kind of set this deadline for myself. I was writing and I drove my car out here, and we're on quarters at UC Davis. So I moved in, I think on the 1st of September, I had about 2/3 of the book done, and classes weren't due to start until the end. And I had kind of tried to set it up so all my furniture would arrive when I got there. That did not turn out to have worked. And so I only had this kind of grotesquely uncomfortable armchair, which is the only place that I could be in the house. And so I sat in this kind of barren, unfurnished apartment from September 1st until September 23rd, just writing 12 hours a day, just to get the rest of it done. And then that was it. And I connected all my notes. I had these fragments and these outlines, and I managed to get it all together. And then I started graduate school. And I think I was absolutely right. I don't know if I would have had the bandwidth to do both. And so, while I do enjoy the kind of mythic, legendary worker status of being able to do both at the same time, it really was not the case. I did one and then the other.
Well, I think that makes us all feel better about you.
Very much.
Oh, was there another question? Sorry.
No, I just said thank you. And yeah, as someone who went through a PhD program, I was like, goodness gracious, I could have also, I don't know, become a real estate agent or a lawyer or played on a professional baseball team, something.
I think that last one is still up for grabs. I think you could do it.
Anyone else have some thoughts or questions?
Well, Tom, I was wondering, this is Lori in Elko, obviously. Hi. We did some discussion before you joined us, so I don't want to be redundant, but my question was, and I hope there's no spoilers for folks who haven't finished the book, because I think there's at least one of us in here, but did you mean to, or can you talk about the significance of an orphan leaving an orphan?
Yeah. I think there's one of this, like, I think for me, I wanted to think about, I think I was trying to avoid it during the writing of it, because I think it's good to write something and then go in and rediscover the themes that have kind of been, at work and processing. I think of writing as a kind of way of slow thinking. And so I was trying to keep this writing mostly about memory and about kind of labor. And when I went back to do revisions, I found that I had this kind of long thread about cyclical processes and kind of reoccurrence. And so during through a couple of revisions, I tried to bring that more to the surface. And one of those was this revision. So the original ending was actually quite different. And it was only after a series of these revisions that we came up with this. I say we. It was me and my editor. He was very patient with me as I missed deadline after deadline. But we came up with this idea of the orphan leaving an orphan, in the sense that there is that harms in the world tend to repeat themselves despite everyone's best intentions. That there are certain kind of patterns that will enact themselves and reenact and be reproduced through kind of inattention or carelessness. And it's those patterns which over time kind of accrete into this kind of sedimentary thing that we call reality, which is made up of these different layers of past actions that have continually being reprocessed and reproduced in our present. And I think it was convenient that I ended it that way, because I actually, the story got optioned for a television show. And we were in the kind of, the creative discussion phase. And one of the questions that was asked to me was, did you have a sequel in mind? Do you have something coming up? And I said, I really hadn't planned one. I think one of the things that I was trying to do was give Ming his kind of free will and right to self-determination back at the end. I feel like I was borrowing this character for this book, and I got to release him back into the wild. And then I remembered, we've got this orphan again. And so we have a seed of something that could become another story. And I think that was very lucky on my part that I actually included that, because it certainly was not intentional.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You mentioned memory, and there was as a theme in the play, or in the story. And Derek, you had a question earlier about memory or a statement, and I wondered if you wanted to, or Tom, you can just talk about memory in this story.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd also love to hear, Derek, what you had to say,
Yeah.
if you are so moved. But I can also talk about memory as well.
It seemed like that was quite a strong theme, and I think in some ways you have answered it in your previous answer, actually, about how things kind of collect and whatnot, because it seemed like you had a lot of characters that were either manipulating memory, did not have a memory, or like even a lot of Ming's decisions were based more off of his drives than it was his memory, as he couldn't remember Ada, right?
Yeah.
And whatnot. So I was just curious, what were some of your philosophical bents that you're going to, because you have a lot of great like moments of violence and things, and then it'll just be these great single sentences that have a philosophical point to it, and then you'll go on into the next thing. So I just wanted to get a peek behind the curtain, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you said philosophical, because I think that is kind of permission for me to talk about this very boring subject, which is the philosophy of personal identity. Which has, I think, been a perennial concern for me since I first kind of dipped my toe into it. And specifically, so John Locke, father of liberalism, father of empiricism. Another thing he's actually quite well known for, especially in the personal identity philosophy circles, is his theory of the memory, what's called the memory theory of personal identity. And so, his answer to the question, who am I today? Who was I yesterday? Who will I be tomorrow? And finally, how do I know that all three of those I's is the same person? Why do I go to bed thinking that I will wake up tomorrow and not, as could be equally logical, that I will be killed at night and tomorrow a new clone of me, one day older, will be instantiated with all my memories up to that point? And for Locke, the answer was that you are you as far back as you can remember. That consciousness is the condition for which memory obtains. And that means that your memory is the extent of your own personal continuity as it goes back in time. And I think, it's such an intuitive theory that it's very hard to categorically reject. You can poke logical holes in it, as some people have. There's one that says, I think Locke is being circular with his reasoning, because he presupposes consciousness and memory as being linked. And so of course he's going to discover that they are linked. And there's another objection that kind of deals with, what if someone has amnesia or memory loss towards the end of their life? You would seem to be able to exist as the same person, but only through different stretches of your life. But Locke wrote that in the 1600s. And today you still have modern philosophers who write full articles that get published responding to Locke. And they'll pay lip service to the critics and permutations of Locke, but they really are still responding to Locke. And as you might know, in academia, that's absurd that someone is still being responded to on a first order basis 400 years after they were published. And so I think for me, I heard about Locke's theory of memory and his theory of personal identity, and I instantly was kind of bowled over, because I personally have really terrible memory. I like to think of myself, I feel like I live in this kind of 6-month moving window of what I can remember, and anything older than that kind of drops off the face of the earth for me, only to be recollected when I see a photo or see a souvenir. And so I'm very particular about keeping little memorabilia, because I think it's the only way that I can access the past. And so I wanted to write a character in the Prophet. I wanted to write a character who would have no access to this past memory and yet maintain this sense of continuity of identity, because he had such faith in the future. And he had such faith in the now as well, that he was able to access this kind of larger body of geological memory that was written in the stones and kind of visible through the works of man. And that would provide him as solid of an identity, as solid of a kind of sense of selfhood and continuity as, you know, the memories of last week I went to the store. And I think for me, the Prophet is my answer to Locke's memory theory, which is to say that there must be, there have to be other ways of being the same person, even if you can't remember. There must be ways that you can carry the past with you, even if you don't want to, or even if you forget. And I think a lot of the book for me was kind of turning on that question of how can you give yourself access to a past that you might not have access to even to begin with. And that was, you know, that's one of the things that comes up, especially when you think about the Chinese workers on the railroad. Their pasts are to us literally irretrievable. None of their experiences, none of their written works, none of their diaries remain. The only thing we have of their work is we have this railroad that they built, which, you know, we can't unmake. And we have the artifacts that they left behind. And so kind of through this kind of archaeological effort of kind of deep memory, it seems, or I hope that it seems, it would be possible to remember something that would otherwise be forgotten.
So what about the other part of the thought experiment then, where the ringmaster keeps dying and coming back to life, but he seems to have all the memories of all his lives. So he is kind of being killed at night and replaced with a clone. But then there's this continuous memory for all of them, right?
Absolutely right. Yeah, which is, and that is, I think, for so there's Locke and his memory theory of personal identity, which is, largely the Western view of personal identity. And there's also this kind of Eastern philosophy or almost like a Zen Buddhist view. And you might have heard it kind of captured in the syntagm of you can't step in the same river twice, even if you cross at the same place, which is that, we kind of flow seamlessly through selves. And it may be impossible to distinguish where this self begins and the next self ends, but we somehow have to find peace with that. And we have to kind of move through these different iterations and these different postures of living. And that our selfhood is expressed rather not as a history or a past, but rather as a pattern of response and approach. That ourselves are encoded in how we react and how we behave rather than what I can remember of my own identity. And so I think the ringmaster is exactly that kind of alternate answer, which is, it would be possible to maintain kind of a total memory and yet have this unstable self that has to be tracked through iterations.
Great, Tom. Thanks for that. And I'm just looking at the time and thinking we've had some good questions, but I think there'll probably be opportunity for discussion in the second part of this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm thinking that now's a good time to move along to the reading sort of portion of tonight.
I'm gonna have a sip of water and then I'll get right to it. So first of all, and I don't know if I said this at the beginning, but thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak to all of you folks, especially knowing that this was picked such a long time ago. I really, it means a lot. I think writing is such an antisocial activity. And you kind of feel like when it's published, you kind of feel like someone has recorded the songs you sing to yourself in the shower, and now everyone's talking about it. And so I am always really heartened to hear that people are actually reading it and even more than that, enjoying it. So it is really a great pleasure to be here tonight. And I just wanted to thank you for having me. I want to read some sections today, actually, that touch on these questions that we've been talking about with death and memory and time, and the process of remembering. So this first section is from quite early on in the book. Ming and the Prophet are traveling through the desert and their horses are dying from underneath them. 10 miles from Elko, their horses stopped and would go no farther. When Ming and the prophet dismounted, the prophet's horse bent its ruined knees and dropped to the dry earth, its breathing a slow and labored death rattle. Ming's horse remained standing, its head hung low, ribs visible through wax paper skin. They had been moving for days now without rest. In the cold pre-dawn light, the two men stood beside their horses and watched the beasts breathing. Soon the sky began to shout with garish streaks of pinks and reds. How similar dawn and dusk appear to the eye unmoored from time, from east and from west. The one approximates the other, and time waits to be set in motion everywhere at once. Their time approaches, the prophet said of the horses, and it was so. His own horse lay stretched out so skeletal and still that it looked to have been already dead for 100 years. The old man knelt to its glassed and sightless eyes and regarded the animal with his own full blindness. We'll reach water soon, Ming said. The Humboldt runs just south of here. His voice was low, almost soothing, as though he were trying to comfort the horses. We will, yes, the prophet said, but they will not. Ming looked at the old man. River's only a few miles away, he said. Maybe they got a few miles left in them. The prophet shook his head and placed a hand over his horse's head, closing its eyes to the world. They will die today, he said. I have told you this before. Ming reached out and stroked his horse's nose, felt the heat coming off its wide nostrils. Its eyes were huge and dark and empty all the way through. His hand resting on the animal, he turned and regarded the wretched form of the prophet's horse, lying motionless on the earth. How long until anyone dies? He murmured to himself. He withdrew his own hand from his horse's nose. The animal's eyes were upon him, an empty gaze, and Ming stared back. For a long time, neither moved. All right, Ming said at last. He hated shooting horses. Get back, he warned the prophet. The old man rose from where he knelt by his own horse and retreated. Ming unholstered his gun and cocked it, and in his mind he traced two intersecting lines across his horse's forehead, drawn from each eye to the opposite ear. Aim at where the lines cross and aim downward, in line with the animal's neck. Any lower, and it would not be a mercy. Death was always a mercy, Silas had told him, pressing the revolver into his small hand so many years ago, after his pony had lost its footing and broken its leg. He must have been only 7 or 8 then. It was his first real kill. He had shot at groundhogs in the fields with the old rifle, hell, even hit some of them, but they were nameless and many and strangers to him. His pony had been livelier than these wasted horses, baying as it tried to stand again on its twisted and fractured leg. Ming had cried and cried, thrown Silas's gun down, refused, out of childish cowardice. One of Silas's men had even come by, revolver in hand, ready to put down Ming's pony for him. But Silas had waved him off. The boy must learn. And when it was finished, Silas had taken the gun, so heavy, from his young and shaking hands, tousled his hair and smiled down at him. Death is always a mercy. He had put down other horses after that, probably a dozen or so by his own count, but it had been many years since the last time, and now he was about to shoot too. He checked his aim and fired. The horse's knees buckled and it crashed to the ground. The prophet's horse threw its head back, its eyes wild, searching desperately for the source of the sound. Its legs kicked feebly in the dust. Ming recocked his gun and stooped low to where the prophet's horse lay struggling, and another shot rang out. For a little while, there was only the dull rustle of the wind passing over the earth. Ming sat down between the bodies of the horses, and wordlessly he reloaded his gun, firing cap, powder, and ball. When he was finished, he stood and dusted loose grains of powder and sand from his trousers. Let's get going, Ming said finally. We'll get water at the Humboldt. Wait, the prophet approached the dead horses. Thank you, he said. He held out his hands, broad and flat over their bodies, and closed his eyes. Return, he breathed. Then he opened his blind eyes and turned to follow Ming. I will tell you what will become of them, the old man said. They continued on foot, closing the distance to Elko, and the prophet told Ming that oceans gave way to dry land, gave way to oceans again. A continuous cycle of deluge and drought. In time beyond time, these alkali barrens would once more be subsumed by a shallow sea, and these clutches of sagebrush and sere grass would be drowned under waters teeming with unfamiliar new life. These hollow bones replaced atom for atom by stones and crystals, reduced to their barest form, the insinuation of a spine, the intimation of a skull. The prophet asked Ming if he knew what it was to be reduced to form, and Ming answered that he did not. They stopped under the linear light of the midday sun to rest, and passing his hands over the earth in strange convolutions, the prophet formed shadows upon the dust. The silhouette of a diving hawk, the profile of a dog, of a man. Form begets form, the prophet said. To be reduced to form is to be reduced to nothing at all. And for the first time in days, Ming felt exhaustion. So I'm 26. I'm very fortunate to have all four of my grandparents still living, but they're all kind of, they're getting up in their up in the years now. My grandfather on my mom's side is 89, and my grandmother, his wife, is 85. And so as they get older, their bodies are kind of beginning to show signs of 8 decades of living. And we're all getting kind of worried that their time might be nearing, but they're a very superstitious bunch, my grandparents, and so they don't like to talk about death. A couple months ago at this point, I realized they hadn't had their pictures taken in decades. Any images that we had of them were kind of accidental shots, maybe at Thanksgiving, a family picture shot on selfie mode or something like that. But they hadn't had their portraits taken in a long time. And I'm not a photographer by any means, but I do have a camera. And I have spent a lot of money pretending to be a photographer. And so I took all my photography gear out, put it in a bag, and flew to New York to try to get their portraits. I brought a light stand, a reflector, the whole shebang. And I got there and I set up the backdrop and made them sit down. And I took all these portraits and I finally picked out 2, and I think they were very lovely. And I showed them to my grandparents, and they were kind of cautious and skittish and unnerved by it, which was not the reaction I expected. And my grandmother said it was because of this superstition that they had about death, which is that speaking of death hastens its arrival. And so they were worried because what it had really seemed like was that I had taken funeral portraits for them, so that now there would be a portrait for them to hang beside the casket when they died. And in my grandmother's consideration, that was quickening the arrival of their death. But in truth, I didn't take those pictures because I was worried that they were going to die. I'm 26, I have all 4 grandparents. I think that old people live forever, most of all my grandparents. But I was worried that I would forget their faces. I'm so forgetful, and faces are hard for me to remember on a good day. And my grandparents' faces, I rarely see them now, maybe only a couple times a year because I live in California. And so I was worried I would forget their faces, especially how they looked, at 85 and 89. I think this is one of the things that troubles me. This is one of the things that I like to think about and talk about in my writing, which is, death is only death for those who are dying. For the rest of us, it is this kind of singular event which divides our own lives, which continue on either side, divides our own lives into this before and this after. The before, where we have someone that we hold dear, and the after, where we're greeted with only this permanent lack that inscribes this kind of echo or this shadow of the person that used to be there. And even when we're born, we're always already living in the aftermaths of deaths that are not our own. The only thing that we're allowed to bring with us after these events, these singular events, is memory, the stuff of the past. It's what we do to guard against oblivion, both of ourselves and of those who die. Roland Barthes has this book, Camera Lucida, where he talks about the photograph. It's a very short book. It was one of the last things that he published. Actually, shortly after he published it, he was hit by a car while crossing the street in Paris and died. And the New York Times, I think, actually put in the obituary that it was an ironic death because he had spent so much of the book thinking about, death and photographs. But in the book, he's analyzing this picture that he has of his mother, who has recently passed. And he is trying to theorize about photography in his kind of French philosophical way, but he keeps coming back to this picture of his mother. He can't get over it. And ultimately, what he arrives at is this kind of very simple, he calls it an almost banal conclusion, which is that the essence of the photograph is not anything to do with the work as a medium or anything like that. It's simply a testament. What the photograph is incontrovertible evidence of the past. And specifically what it does is it says a statement, which is that this thing in this picture was there. And for that reason, it has inordinate power. I think this question of memory and what photographs and what the past can bring forward is a really deep obsession for me because I have such a terrible memory, as I was talking about. And I think one of the ways that I kind of made my peace with it is that I convinced myself that other things could remember for us, that memory was not simply a privilege afforded to humans, but actually one that was co-owned by every living thing and even non-living things. So in this next section, Ming is traveling with a magic show. They've just moved past Antler Peak and they're making their way onto the next town. They cross into the lengthening shadow of Antler Peak in the annealing afternoon heat of the third day. At the foothills of the range, they followed strange markings in the stones to a shaded pit beneath a black stone bluff, and there they found water as promised, pooling cold and clean. The horses watched parched and anxious while the party filled their canteens, and only then were they allowed to approach the pool and drink, and in a matter of minutes, they drained all that remained in the small wellspring. Ming sat on the running board of the stagecoach and worked his railroad spike to a mirror finish, while night fell upon them suddenly. They ringed the fire in a tight circle, their backs hunched against the desert chill. The prophet was humming to himself. "What's that tune, old man?" Proteus asked gruffly. The prophet stopped and smiled. He fixed his clouded eyes on the ringmaster's double. "An old elegy," he said, and resumed humming. "The hell's an elegy?" "A song for the dead," the ringmaster replied. He plucked a burning twig from the fire and lit his pipe. "Well, are there any words in them songs?" The prophet shook his head. "In time, all songs lose their words, and in time beyond time, most lose even their music. Songs without language or melody become as dreams, persisting in the mind without reason, without substance. There is only the memory of the song once having been." "Well, who's this one for?" Proteus asked. "Every dead," the prophet answered. The ringmaster pulled deeply from his pipe and regarded the prophet with a kind of reverence. "Your companion, Mr. Sue, tells me you have no memory," he said. "Yes," the prophet said. "Well, what good is an elegy sung by a man who cannot remember?" "Why, you, sir," the prophet said. "Can you remember?" "Of course," the ringmaster said. The prophet fell silent for a moment and then spoke. "It is not so. No man truly remembers the past, and those who claim to are mistaken. Remembrance is the burden of the body, not of the mind. True memory is not to be recollected. It is a rite to be performed. Memories of place and routine, these are true memories. The past enacted continuously in the present as ritual and habit. True memories sound on registers below what the mind can touch. Men can misremember, men can lie, but the body cannot forget because it has no means of forgetting." He extended a withered arm and pulled back his sleeve to reveal a spiderweb of thin white scars encircling his wrist. "Flesh rubbed raw from irons," he murmured. "My body remembers a time when it was in chains, even while I cannot." The ringmaster seemed to take this in, and he stretched out his hands and warmed them, moving them this way and that in the low light from the dwindling fire. "You asked me," the prophet said, "what good an elegy is when sung by a man who cannot remember. But all men cannot remember." His voice was clear and lucid. "An elegy is good merely because it is sung, and when its words are lost, it is still good because it is sung. And when its melody, too, has been washed away, it is still good because it was once sung." He rose to his feet and cast his blind eyes over the men sitting around the fire. "To sing at all is to labor, and it is only by labor that men living recall the shadows of men past. This is what it means to remember." So I have this kind of bit of funny trivia that sometimes will get a laugh, but I'll say, it takes so long to drive from Sacramento to Salt Lake City and back because those two cities just can't wait to get away from each other. And I mean that in a very kind of true geological sense. Over the last 50 million years, those two cities have been on either end of a plate that has been kind of spreading apart. And so they've actually increased their distance by about 50 miles in those last 50 million years. And so it has become literally a little more difficult to get from one city to the other. What's happened, though, as the plate expands, it doesn't expand cleanly. It's not like silly putty. It's almost like if you had a creme brulee on top of silly putty and you began to stretch it. And what happens to that top layer is that that rock fractures into blocks. And each of these blocks has their own center of gravity. They're irregularly shaped. And so however they break apart from one another, that's not how they would like to be. And so they would actually like to be oriented a certain way. And over eons, they begin to tilt. and one end of the block sinks down, and the other end rises up. And as it rises up, the tops of it are, whipped away by erosion of wind and rain and ice and expansion. And eventually you get this topology, which dominates Northern Nevada, which is a basin and range topology. And in there you find gold. And I always thought that was so remarkable, that we are kind of living in this present that, that gold is convenient for us because we have developed a society that runs on something called money, and we like things that are precious, and gold is very hard to find, and it's non-reactive, and so it becomes important to us. And because we found it in Nevada, all these different towns and industries cropped up, and even today, gold mining and silver mining, that's a huge part of Nevadan economy. And I always thought it was so fascinating how much the present that we live in, regardless of whether or not we pay attention to it, but it's always contingent. And what I mean by that is, it didn't have to be this way. It could be a million other ways, and yet it is this way. And it is this way because of this past that we are always dealing with the consequences of. And I like to say that, always the present is structured by the past. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to kind of explore. That one of the questions that I really wanted to think about in this book. And I think one of the ways that I wanted to approach that was this process of fossilization, where things can die and become mineralized, and little of their actual original substance remains. They only have this kind of shape, which becomes recognizable to us as the bones or the skull or the teeth of some long dead animal. But which, for all intents and purposes, is just mineralized, something that was once organic, but has now been rendered inorganic by eons of sedimentary and geological processes. So, in this next section, the party is approaching Pyramid Lake, and they come across this great mudflat. They spent the next day moving through a white heat that bleached the landscape to alabaster. A short while after lunch, they came across a slow rise in the earth that seemed at first to be an outcropping of stones. Objects of broken lines and curves speckled the horizon. As they drew nearer, Ming saw that they were the color of old bone, pale creams and grays, ribs and vertebrae, and the caved-in remnants of an enormous skull still bearing all its teeth, its bones snaking through the hard-packed dirt. Ming knelt and wiped the dust from a vertebra, ran his fingernail over the ridges and grooves of that old bone. He tugged at it, buried in the dirt, but could not dislodge it. With his rail spike, he began to excavate the bone. Ribs, the ringmaster said. It's a lot more than ribs, Ming said. He levered the vertebra out of the ground with the point of his spike and brushed the loose dirt from its surface as he stood. The bone was heavier than he expected, and he tossed it from hand to hand, familiarizing himself with its weight. He gestured with it toward the ground. There's a whole skeleton here. The line of vertebrae continued from where Ming had been digging, the bones widening as they went up the line and then disappearing for a length underground before emerging, a few yards distant, replete with an eruption of ribs, mostly broken, of which some still intact rose out of the earth, a head taller than any man Ming had ever seen. Ming helped the prophet down from his horse and led him into the center of the ribs. The old man's feet rocked back and forth on a vertebra in the dust. He placed a withered hand on one of the ribs and closed his eyes. Something huge, Gomez mused. He ran a finger along the arc of one, rubbed the dust between his fingers. What do you reckon it was? An example of a great fish, I think, the ringmaster said, the same kind that swallowed up Jonah. You're a man of God, Gomez, are you not? Aye, Gomez replied, but this ain't like no fish I ever caught. He wandered over to where the vast skull lay crushed in the dirt and worked a long, vicious tooth free. He tossed it into the air and caught it again, held it up to the sunlight and inspected it a while. When he was satisfied, he slipped the tooth into his pocket and patted it. As they were leaving to continue down toward the southern tip of the Suaves, the ringmaster asked the prophet what this creature had once been. And the old man replied that it was indeed a great fish, as the ringmaster had reckoned, but like no fish that still left and swam, as Gomez had observed. The prophet said that it had been a creature of an antediluvian age, that long ago it swam here in a sunlit sea 40 fathoms deep. And he said that this land was once somewhere else, that indeed all land had once been somewhere else, that the earth turned and turns in an endless sweep of placelessness. The prophet spoke of mountains ground to dust in the blink of an ancient eye, of chasms chiseled through sandstone. Our world, he said, was but a fiendish patchwork of rock and water seamed under the oceans with fire and rock, That night, Ming dreamed he rode through a world spinning itself to pieces. He dreamed of reins held tight and the vast and sickening lurch of the world beneath it. Time beyond time. So my grandparents, my mother's parents, 85 and 89, they were born in the 30s in China. They lived through a world war, a famine, a cultural revolution, and a lot of other things too. And now they're here in New York City, where I am right now. And the reason I'm here now, and actually the reason that I was late today, is because they're getting quite sick. And so, my grandfather's in the hospital, and my grandmother had thyroid cancer a couple of years ago, and now it's come back. It was discovered, they took a PET scan, and it lit up all throughout her body as these kind of inordinately beautiful luminous dots, each one of them signifying a potentially lethal metastatic cancer. So she took iodine, radioiodine. She had surgery, and there was one that was in her neck that they couldn't quite get out. And so now she's in radiation therapy, and it's wearing her thin. And she's drinking Ensure to kind of keep her weight up, and she's a little scared, and we all are. But I don't feel that scared. I think she'll make it. I think she's a fighter. But it made me think, there's this kind of whole logistics of death and kind of the approach to death that we try our best not to think about. And then when it comes time to actually get to it, the minutiae and the kind of unspeakable boredom of it all is I find way more exhausting than any of the grief, the attendant grief. And one of those things is burial plots. And my grandmother, she's superstitious about death, but she finally, she came up to me a couple of weeks ago and she said, I'm worried that if your grandfather doesn't make it, we don't have a burial plot for him. And I this, kind of struck me as being odd. Because I assumed that they would be cremated, but of course no one ever asked because it was a touchy subject. And I said, well, is that what you want? Is that what, you would like to be buried? And my grandmother said that yes, because in China, there's been some law that's been in place for ages and ages, maybe because of the population, maybe for some other inscrutable reason. But when people die in China, they are always cremated. Very few people are ever buried. There's simply not enough space. And so my grandmother said that it was actually a great honor to be buried. And that really struck me. I hadn't realized. I think one thing that we think about as we kind of think about death is we always think about what the person will leave behind. That there's kind of going to be this collection, this network of objects and affairs that they've left either unfinished or that have some relation to them, and that we can fix their shadow in the focus point of all of these objects in this network. And as we distribute, and sell off or donate or transmute some of these objects into objects of less sentimental import, we begin to distribute that memory of the dead among ourselves until we integrate it fully. But this question of burial, I think, really struck me because suddenly there became a place where I could go, presumably, to visit them after they've passed. And my grandmother, always the pragmatist, she said that there was no point in just buying one. She heard that there were group discounts. And so she might as well just get a burial plot for my grandfather and for herself and my mother, my father, and me. Why not? To secure the best price on a family plot. And that gives me the heebie-jeebies. That I would know where I would be buried, hopefully decades and decades before it actually comes to pass. So one of the things that I want to end with is this question of how we remember the dead, what activities we do to cement for ourselves that they existed, that they were there. The photograph is one of those technologies, but I think there's something else which I wanted to kind of mull over, and that was labor. That it is always a choice to remember those who have passed, and that choice is something we do actively, and it's because it's a conscious choice that we are able to bring them back from the dead, if only for a little bit, to ask them to stay a while and to have them with us while we do the activity. So in this last section, Ming is crossing the Sierras on his own. He's hungry, he's thirsty, he hasn't slept for days, he's cold. At altitude, time passes differently. Darkness before sunset, the land not going to morning until long after the sky has bleached blue and bone white. The days lose their order. The mountains know their own way. He who traverses these slopes passes through a realm not entirely his own. In the rarefied air, his breath comes quick and shallow, and he pants as he climbs. And all around him, the world pulls down, down, and down again, endless goings down, avalanche and rock slide and filthy lahars kicked off by thunderstorms that carry whole forests down into the valley in their boiling wakes. He sees this going down everywhere he looks. He feels the stones sliding beneath his feet. In the rivers and in the rocks, invisible undertows drag all things ultimately out to sea. He was descending the slope of the mountain when he noticed a strange boulder covered in snow some 100 yards down from the rails. When he reached it, he saw that it was a man, clearly dead, though for how long Ming couldn't tell. The body was frozen solid, the man's skin bleached a ghastly white by the sun and the ice. Whatever snow cover had sheltered it from thaw must have only recently receded. A wind sidled along the snowdrifts as Ming regarded the shape. They were in a bowl formed by the intersection of 3 peaks. Clouds from the Pacific pushed up overhead and evaporated in the thin air. The man had died face down in the snow. His limbs were frozen in place where they had draped over the small boulder on which he had ultimately come to rest. Ming crouched by the body, inspecting it. Then he took the man by the wrist and turned him over. The body, stiff and cold as marble, rocked back and forth on the curve of his back, arms and legs hugging a phantom, moving like a wooden life-size doll. There was something unsettlingly infantile about the way the body had been frozen. Even in the absence of color in the dead man's face, Ming could see that he was Chinese. Rags clung to his body in tatters. Scavengers had plucked out his eyes and his tongue. His throat had been bloodied ages ago by some carrion eater, and the blood had frozen before it could dry, a violent smear of red ice welded to alabaster skin. He stared up with sightless sockets at the infinite blue of the Sierra sky. Ming guessed the man was no more than 20. He brushed a thin covering of snow from a nearby stone and sat down, gazing at the dead man. The world was quiet but for the sound of the wind combing through the trees. Up the grade, where the granite near the tracks had been sheared from the rock face by powder and fuse, it was fresh and unoxidized. In geological time, the bluff had been blasted yesterday. Ming couldn't remember having worked this cut, couldn't remember this dead and frozen Chinese, and yet he knew they must have been here. And so he reconstituted a false memory. There would have been days of labor drilling holes into the raw face of the slope, then careful packing of those holes with black powder. Fuse lines running down the side of the mountain, and then the report of the blast, the secondary reports of its echoes ricocheting around the range. A mass of rock and snow sent flowing like water, snow crystals shimmering in the light. A snowslide, 1,000 tons of white, crashing down the mountain, sweeping this dead Chinese off his feet, casting him down onto these lonely and shifting slopes, leaving him to scavengers before subsequent slides entombed him in snow that would not melt for years. The memory was good, and he could see it in his mind. The dead Chinese glittered in the sunlight. Ming couldn't decide whether to bury him. Overhead, a vulture circled lazily. It is through labor that men remember anything at all, he imagined the prophet telling him. But he had no spade with which to dig a grave, and the ground here was already too frost-hardened to yield to the blade of a shovel anyway. Ming stood from the rock he'd been sitting on and started off along his route again, cutting across the slope to the railroad. But he made it only a dozen paces before he stopped, troubled by something he couldn't quite name. The body of the dead Chinese swayed gently on the point of the man's spine, moving with the wind. Ming turned and went back to him. "I'm sorry," he said, and he was startled by the sound of his own voice. He had been too long in silence. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." He glanced around, trying not to look directly at the dead man's ravaged face. "I ain't got nothing to bury you with." The Chinese rocked a little and was still. The wind had died down. Ming took the body by one icy ankle and dragged it a ways toward the shade of the nearby pines. The skin of the dead man's ankle began to thaw in his grip, and with a sickening lurch, Ming felt it soften enough to slide over the bones of his ankles, and he nearly let go of the body out of revulsion. He shook his head to steady his thoughts and pulled the man into a clearing shaded by pines, and shuddering, he released the ankle. His hand was numb with cold now and dripping with melted ice. He bent down and pinched some snow between his fingers to wash his hands. The dead man's frozen spine had carved a shallow rut in the snow as he'd been dragged, And still, he hugged the remembered boulder, arms and legs locked in that death embrace. With a wary hand, Ming gingerly tipped him over onto his side. The dead man's fingers dipped into the thin, early-season snow on the ground and left shallow divots. Sunlight filtered down through the cathedral of pines. Ming gathered some fallen branches whose needles had gone yellow and brittle and laid them on top of the Chinese. They were not enough to cover the body, and through the gaps in the branches came flashes of pearl white and crimson, skin and blood. Ming unclasped his pack and set it down and went back to where he'd first found the man sprawled atop that fallen boulder, and from the rubble that had come down from the blast, he began to collect stones. When his arms were full, he returned to the body and heaped the rocks on the dead Chinese. It was not enough. Still, the man's ghoulish face gazed through the trees. Ming needed more stones. It took him 6 trips, each time returning laden with stones before he had enough to cover him. He kicked his boots into the trunk of a pine to work blood back into his feet and shoved his hands into his pockets to warm, clenching and unclenching them, feeling his freezing fingertips digging into the soft skin of his palm. When he had regained sensation enough, he drew his hands from his pockets and sat down cross-legged by the body, obscured with fallen branches and stones. The man's arms and legs were locked in their sockets, and try as he might, Ming could not move them, could not force the Chinese's frozen legs to lie down straight, nor cross his thin wrists over his sunken chest. The body might as well have been carved from stone. Ming placed a branch over the man's hollow eye sockets and used the remaining ones to fill the empty space between the man's limbs that the boulder had once occupied. And now he began to build a great cairn, stone locked against stone, a heap of fractured granite and black shale and waxy chips of green-gray chert. By the time he was finished, the sky was beginning to darken, the temperature dropping with each passing moment, and he gazed upon the cairn he had built in the deepening evening. He opened his mouth to say something, hail and farewell perhaps, but could find no words. He wondered if the dead Chinese beneath the stones would have been able to understand him in life. He wondered if the dead Chinese had family across the sea, waiting for word of his successes. And he wondered if the dead Chinese would have thanked him for dragging his body into the forest, for heaping him with stones, for standing now mute and pale over his frozen corpse, at last bearing witness to his death. To die nameless and unremembered and unmourned on a frozen embankment in a land far from home. What was it the old man had said? Ming stretched his frozen hands over the stones in the failing light, breathing vapor into the chill night air. Return, he murmured. Thank you.
Oh boy. Thank you. That was just more than I expected, certainly. It was just terrific. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All of those insights. It's just wonderful. Gail, I don't know, here we are. We have a few more minutes, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's been fun also as we've been watching the life behind you unfold it through the window, the lights going by. There was
oh yes, I think there was a cop car or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
So everything's fine. So
everything became red for a second. I was
it was
concerned
wonderful.
that
It worked very well.
Yeah. So John, we do have a question in the
Yes.
chat.
Good.
So Dory was curious what Tom, what your grandparents say about your book, or have they read your book? Or
yeah, so they can only they're Chinese speakers, and so they only kind of have gotten my elementary level Chinese summary of the book. They know of the awards that it's gotten. They're very proud, but they haven't read the book yet. Although it was sold to a Mandarin publisher just last month. And I think the contract term for that is 18 months before they deliver the final thing. And so I've been telling my grandparents, if you just hold on for 18 months and then however long it takes for you to read the book, then you can be finished, but you can't go until then. But yeah, so with time, it'll come out in Chinese, and then my entire extended family will finally get the chance to read it. They'll have no excuse. But until then, yes, it is only in English. So they actually have not gotten the chance to read it yet.
I have a question, Tom.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, your presentation is just so thoughtful and so kind and so important at this time. Everything that you talked about that you brought to this book and beyond, it just.
Thank you.
But I'm curious. Yes, thank you. There's a beautiful portrait over your shoulder, and I guess in the interest, if I don't ask, I'll never know. Can Can you talk about her?
Yes, this is not my home. I'm actually in my friend's home, which is close to where I've been kind of traveling back and forth, because I don't really live here anymore. And my mother's house is a COVID no-go zone. So this is actually where I am just doing, I'm coming to you live from this third location. I'm not sure who that is.
Oh, well, that's good. Then we can all just write
Yes.
our own stories about her.
Exactly. Fill in the blank.
Thank you.
So Tom, I did have a question
Yes.
about, I guess just because at GBC and in different aspects of my life, I've been doing a lot of diversity reading, like many people have since George Floyd's killing. So it was difficult for me to not look through that lens when I was reading your book. And so there are these kind of what we could call stereotypes of these different characters. And I just wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, because I mean, at first I was like, oh my gosh, am I supposed to read these literally, or is this, there's the magical Navajo, and then there's the blind prophet, and there's, there's the kind of handy, Mexican, so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the questions that I started this book with that ultimately got folded into a bunch of other permutations was this question of to what extent is our identity endogenous? Does it come from us? Is who we are deep inside us and we push that outwards, or is it kind of given to us by as we move through culture and society and we interact with people? Is our identity kind of pressed upon us from without? And I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of play with was exactly that, which is the effect that stereotypes have on deforming the way that someone is allowed to behave and be processed. That it literally generates blindnesses in certain characters' ability to be kind of seen and distinguished, and in others it makes them easily forgotten. And I think one of the things that was important to me, as far as establishing these characters, was that it was unremarkable to them. These stereotypes that they kind of are pushing through, that they're kind of working around, that the magic that these performers have is not special, and it's just a facet of kind of who they are, but they're prevented from existing in a certain mode because of those powers that they have. And so you kind of have this ragtag bunch of people who have kind of world-changing, dynamic powers who are relegated to this position of spectacle. And I think this conversion into spectacle is just one of the ways that American society has dealt with fear of the other and fear of foreigners, is by kind of transmuting the dangerous foreigner, the dangerous stereotype into this thing, like this tokenized fragment of a personality that can be passed back and forth and readily integrated into polite society as a spectacle. And I think it was a lot of fun to kind of build this transgressive magical party, and then put them through these paces of this Western where their powers were only incidental to how they behaved and how they acted.
That's great, thank you.
That's wonderful. Actually, I was just thinking that in the time we had before you arrived, that where we had a very broad discussion, and I think you've addressed just about everything that we discussed before you arrived. So,
I'm glad.
Yeah, no, it's terrific. So we are, Gail, I'm wondering if you want to turn back on everyone's cameras, because I think we're approaching 7 o'clock Pacific time and 10 o'clock Eastern time. If there were, I thought if there were any final questions or comments from anyone, that now would be the time to chime in.
Yeah, I actually, and it's more just a data point, I guess. But when the pagan tries to mimic Ming, is that a portion of racism? Is that a portion of not of him being a man out of bounds. What is the lens that we should be looking at that scene
Yeah.
from?
I will preface, North Fry has this great line where he says that what the author says should have peculiar interest, but not peculiar authority. So if this is not in line with your reading of it, feel free to disregard this entirely. For me, that mechanism was that Proteus's ability to convincingly duplicate someone is beholden to what the people around him are willing to accept and differentiate. And so in that instance, because of this kind of totalizing monolithic view of Asians in America at that time, Proteus is unable to stabilize as a particular one. You'll notice that throughout the rest of the book, Ming will find posters that are supposed to be him that are not like him. The sheriff hangs that person that they think is him. One of the things that Ming, I think, is struggling with is like this feeling that his identity is not his own to have, and let alone to kind of stake out for himself, because he's always continuously being subsumed under this monolithic banner, this John Chinaman that everyone keeps referring to him as. And so that Proteus's inability to switch to Ming precise, as Ming himself, I think is one articulation of that belief. But again, peculiar interest, not peculiar authority. If this is not what you believe, I never said it.
Yeah, and absolutely love it, and I really appreciate you going through and answering our questions for it too. But how fascinating to see that as a collective consciousness of racism affecting his ability, because I was definitely trying to take it from his side out. That is quite cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I had a quick question, John, that I wanted to ask Tom. So this is kind of a boring question about genre, I guess, but I mean, I was just wondering, like, what made you want to do a Western? Like, what pushed you into that particular genre? And also, just in light of a lot of the stuff that you've been talking about, do you envision this as kind of like a revisionist Western? Like, I mean, you're definitely faithful to a lot of like sort of classic, archetypes of the Western, but you're doing all this different stuff with identity that, I mean, how do you see your use of the genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the Western, I think, is one of our greatest exports as a country, that we've managed to do. We came up with the idea of, this genre, and then immediately we exported it everywhere. We got into, spaghetti Westerns, we got into Italy, we got into Spain, we made it all the way to Japan for the samurai movies, Kurosawa, and we even got into space, with these like space Western epics. And the one thing that like we are still yet to do enough of is to like put people in the Westerns that were actually there, who weren't just white men. And so I think for me, it was like, it was the fact that it seemed so transgressive and new, even just to do that simple substitution, I think really drew me in. But I think the other thing is like, the critic Jane Tompkins she has a whole book about Westerns as a genre. And one of the things that she says defines the Western is that they're not, they can be about masculinity, they can be about violence, but at the end of the day, what they really seem to be about is this kind of ultra saturated moment when you are totally present, when there is no past or future, you're 100% activated in the process of being alive now. And she cites this joke that was sent into Reader's Digest in the 60s. And it goes like this: a husband and a wife are about to enter a department store because the wife needs to buy a new dress. And they run into another couple that they're friends with. And they have a quick chat, and the husbands decide, one of them's just gotten a new boat. And so they decide, we'll let the women shop, and then we'll go and we'll go boating. And so the women go to the department store, and the husbands go, they get this boat, they drag it onto the water. They're having a great time. A storm rolls in, and it's hailing, and it's miserable, and it's cold, and the wind is driving them, and it pushes them up onto this island in the middle of the lake. And they get out, and they're waist deep in water, and they're pushing and they're shoving, and they're muddy and they're cold. And one of the husbands turns to the other one and says, "Yeah, sure beats shopping." And Tompkins points to that as being this kind of like emblematic articulation of what we want the Western to be, and kind of what we come to expect from it, which is it is this kind of triumphant victory of manliness and especially masculine suffering as a way of building character. And I think that certainly has become a little dated, but I think the bones of the Western are good. It's just been it's used for an imperialist purpose in a lot of instances, because it's also the story of why we as a nation not only came to possess all this land in between, and where did all the Native Americans go, but also to justify it. It has a normative bent to it. Not only do we have this, but we also ought to have this. And I think I like the genre because it seems to me to be so full of promise and so expansive, and such a fantastic American export. And I wanted to see what it could do if you just made it a little different, if you pointed in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, that's a good answer.
Yeah, that's terrific.
Have you read Oakley Hall? Have you ever read the classic Warlock?
Oh, I actually have not, but I'll add it to my list.
Check it out. Pynchon, and who knows if Pynchon was being serious at the time. Somebody asked him, "What's your favorite book?" He's like, "Oakley Hall's Warlock." And so,
okay, absolutely, I'll check that out.
Well, wonderful. Can you give us a hint about what's next? From the
Sure.
author of The Thousand Crimes?
Yes. And I'm not being coy. This is really as much as I have for myself too. It's science fiction. It's part of it is set in a nuclear silo, and it features a device which grants you subjective immortality.
Great.
So that's
My
what I've
uncle
got.
worked in a nuclear silo for some time. So
It sounds
but that subjective immortality comes back.
yeah, wow.
you need
Well,
to come
this
back.
has been. Oh, go ahead, Gail. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. It's Lori. I
Oh,
just was
Lori,
saying,
sorry.
Tom, you'll need to come back to Nevada. Then it sounds like you need to do more research out here.
Oh, if you'll
Yeah.
have me, I
We'd love it.
Yeah, so Tom, I have to ask, did you, when you were coming through, did you ever divert into up to Tuscarora when you were going across?
No, I unfortunately did not. The conceit of it was that I could do as much as I could without spending too much on gas.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because actually Tuscarora had the largest Chinatown between San Francisco and Salt Lake during that whole period of after that.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway,
Fantastic.
And we know where you could stay in Tuscarora. Have a
Yeah.
place.
Yeah, right. We have an insight. Yeah. Anyway,
Well, Tom, I just want to wrap it up from my end, and then I'll turn it over to you, Gail. But I want to thank you so much for your time and your insights. It was so thoughtful. I just, here we are on a Thursday night, and I mean, together on Zoom, and this has been one of the most wonderful Zoom experiences I've had in some time. So we really appreciate it, and all of our guests here, we appreciate you coming as well, because it's part of our outreach, and it's very important to our students at Great Basin College, and we are so happy that you were able to join us. So I'll turn it over.
I'm very happy I made it, and thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, and just echoing what John said, thank you everybody for joining us. This it is being recorded, so share it with your friends. I know there was a lot of folks that weren't able to join us that wanted to. We just finished our semester here, Tom, and grades.
Congratulations.
Yes, grades were actually due Tuesday, so I'm surprised we have any instructors that showed up. So I'm thrilled. So what we will do is we will take a rain check on your next book. And so we'll pencil you in, and we would love to have you back to join us and talk about that. And we'll look forward to that. We'll look forward to the cinematic version of this, whether it's TV or a movie. I could see a movie for sure. So we're excited for you for that.
Thank you guys
And
so
remember,
much.
Tom, I asked for a role or an opportunity.
That's right. Yeah.
Got you in mind. Don't worry.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. If you have
I'm
any problems with casting, just let us know. We'll take a look at it.
Absolutely.
And I'm looking forward to the dissertation, by the way.
Yeah.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
I'm willing to see the monograph before the next novel.
That's right. That's great. All right. Well, thank you so much. And I am going
Thanks,
to,
Tom.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you,
Have a good
everyone. I'm
night.
going to go ahead and take us
All right.
off of record, and then you guys can still